Hi everyone, it's me, Abdul Rehman, and I am accompanied with my friend, counselor therapist Zamin Dante. He has worked with people recovering from addictions and mental illness. Thank you, Zamin, for joining me on such a crucial issue of sexual abuse, trauma, and silence.
It's a delight to be with you, Abdul.
Thank you. So, Zamin, we will start with the first part, which is trauma happens within a context. So, what will you say about that?
Well, that's a very important understanding. Basically, a trauma just doesn't happen. It happens in the midst of something. For
Mm-hmm.
example, a soldier in warfare, or a child abused in a home, or even if you were on the street being hit by a car. There's been a
Mm-hmm.
trauma, but there's a situation, and the situation really affects the trauma. For example, let's say that I was raped by an uncle,
Mm-hmm.
and rape is against the law. And if my uncle, if it's brought to the authorities, my uncle will go to jail. So all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden, I may have been abused in a situation where to bring it into public light would cause even more problems.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where even the word silence in our title, Sexual
Mm-hmm.
Abuse, Trauma, and Silence, comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So I may be forced into a silence by the context.
I see. So it's like, I mean, it's something like banishing from your consciousness because it's like trauma within trauma. Because,
It's a trauma within a trauma. I should also just add briefly, some traumas happen within war. There's rape as an aspect of war, where women
Mhm,
are raped. There's more of a domination than just a sexual pleasure. There are gang initiations where people are raped. There's sexual slavery and also trafficking. So I just wanted to
mhm,
make that note beyond domestic abuse.
mhm, Yep, that makes sense. The people suffering from PTSD, like the victims of war when they were raped there, right? So
Yes,
I'll yeah. So I'll just sum up that, like what you said is trauma happens within a context, like in a family. If someone is raped, so if it's someone from their own family who actually abused them, and it gets a problem actually reaching out to authorities or bringing that into the light, because it would be because it's kind of it gets a kind of a moral problem and issues within the family, because if someone from the family is actually brought into the light, or they are just handed over to authority, it's a kind of a trauma within a trauma. It gets more complicated. So that's why people mostly get silenced over the trauma of sexual abuse, right?
yes, that's quite correct. And there's an old AA, Alcoholics Anonymous bit of wisdom, which says we're sick as our secrets.
Hmm.
So oftentimes we have a sick secret that must be kept, and it
Hmm.
just eats at the soul.
So I'll also share some of like my insights from Pakistani or like subcontinent culture. It's my own like subjective opinion. People can have difference of opinion, but what I think is like people, usually the parents, they carry the collective shadow, or they project their collective shadow on the sexual abuse victims. So what happened is that they start thinking that how would they survive in the society with these dark secrets, or maybe with these secrets of shame. So what happens is that the fear of parents is actually projected onto the victim, and eventually they're taught to be silent, right? So parents, in case of usually girls or women, fear about their marital process and their future. So the cost of, you can say, the girl's marital life is at the expense of their mental and psychological health, and that really happens. So I mean, the shadow of parents, when the parents are not aware of their fear, like actually they, what they are doing is due to their own fear, right? So so they so what happens is that when they neglect their own fear, the one who suffers is the victim, because they have to go through all that. So you can say that that's the pseudo sense of reputation and morality, which often punishes the victim. And like in our culture, it's mostly the mothers who are considered for the upbringing of the children. So they're also afraid that if they shared that secrets with their husbands or fathers, so it's eventually they would be blamed for everything, for the abuse that was happened with the child. So you can say that shadow fear of the mothers is also one of the factor for silencing the child's trauma. So they go into the denial, and eventually the victims are silenced. That's what I think happens within my culture.
Yes, it sounds very similar in some ways to even American culture. There's a moral wounding that happens, and it's often to the victim, and then the victim is blamed, and there's a sense of you're impure, and somehow the idea is that there's a moral wounding, and very often the idea is that you are impure, and you've brought an impurity upon yourself and upon the family. Basically, there's a moral wounding that takes place, and there's a sense that one is impure. And so basically you're blamed for the impurity. So it's you who did this, you who seduced the elder. It's because you're really damaged goods, or just something really wrong with you in the first place. So the child doesn't have a way of really making sense of what happened. Think a child at 5, 6, 7, 8, or teenage, even early teenage. There's a sense of self-blame, because in some ways, if you're dependent on a parent to take care of you, to see them as a monster is so terrifying that you'd rather blame yourself.
Exactly. I would just extend that argument. I would say that mostly the children, they have a very moral sense of their parents, that they can't complain to the parents, or the parents can never be bad, or they can never actually be responsible for anything, right? I'm not blaming the parents for every abuse happens, but what I'm saying is that the children develop a sense of morality, or whatever you can say, that they think the parents shouldn't be blamed for their state.
Yeah, I would think that in some societies we're conditioned to blame ourselves. And it's like self-blame is looked on as a virtue. Finding your faults is looked on as a virtue. If something goes wrong and an authority or a superior person tells you that you're to blame, that's absolute. And to find a way to take back that ground and finally see, no, even though it was an authority or it was a parent, there's a wrong. I've been wronged. And this may sound strange to some people, but in a way you have to see that you're a victim before you can begin to do something. Of course, you don't want to be stuck in a victimhood. You want to move through that, but that may take a good while to do. This is not simple stuff.
Exactly. I mean, it carries with individual pace, and you can't just force the healing process, right?
No, that's correct. And this can take years, and someone may say it's a weakness of character, but if you've been multiply raped and by an intimate relative, or if you've been raped in wartime by numerous people, I'm even thinking like a group like ISIS, it would rape women to break them in, they would sell them as sexual slavery. You just can't say to someone, get over it. I mean, these are deep, deep marring wounds that mar character, mar identity, leave a person fractured and fragmented, even psychotic. You have to realize severe trauma will fracture the psyche.
That's true.
And repeated severe trauma.
Exactly. So it's like how the self-blame starts is like when they think that they're carrying like dark secrets, or they are very toxic secrets actually, that shouldn't be, or it creates a sense of uncomfortability within them, because obviously like a trauma is not a small thing, so obviously it creates a sense of uncomfortability, that it's a very toxic secret, shame, and we are the one to be blamed, so it kind of turns into self-blame. And I think that's our very next slide. That's the next one.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing. It's like there are layers of it being toxic. And remember, a rape is a violent act. Okay, it can be a seductive act, but it's also a violent act. So picture not like the violence of hitting and slapping someone, and something that goes on for 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 minutes over and over and over again. The effect of that on a child. When Freud first began working with women, they were mostly called hysterics, like they had hysteria, which he first believed their stories that they had been raped or abused as children. And he listened to them, and some began to do better. But then he felt a pressure from his own society. It was a Victorian, Edwardian society that did not want to believe that adults were raping children. And they pressured him, and he recanted his theory, and he began to say things like, well, it's all of this Oedipal complex and other complexes that are happening. Not that there isn't some truth in that, but it denied the actual abuses that were happening. And it took many years to begin to see that. Now, here's another interesting thing. The same symptoms that hysterical women were showing is often what you see in soldiers that had battle fatigue or PTSD. All the different fragmentations and anxiety reactions and nightmares and disassociations. So Freud was on the right track, but because of societal pressure covered it up. And this is like similar to our societies now, which often cover up the fact that there's an abuse underneath something and it's not just some problem in the person that's been abused.
Exactly. Maybe the adults are not ready to accept their own, like the dragons or the monsters within them. So they are not ready to accept their own shadows.
Yes, and also if we think we're a moral society, how do we deal with the fact that maybe 1 in 4 children are being abused? In America, that's the number. They estimate that 1 in 4 children have been abused, either physically or sexually.
I mean, I'm not sure about I'm not sure about what's the number in Pakistan, but it's really common now. It's really common now.
Yeah, and it's very sad because a society that's under great stress and anxiety, and oftentimes in war footings or where there's a lot of tension, acts out its aggression, and it often acts it out against the child. Or some vulnerable and weak, and women are more vulnerable, and children are the most vulnerable.
That's true.
Sometimes we have elder abuse too, which fits into that same thought.
Great. So I think that's very important one. Rage into the shadows, toxic, wounding, and shamed.
Yes. Basically, there are a couple of myths that really talk about how this happens. And the beauty of Greek myths are not about Greek religion. So we're not studying the religion and worship of Greek gods, but Greek myths really tell a great deal about the psyche and the processes in the psyche. So they're very, very important. And there's a wonderful myth of Medusa. And the story of Medusa, it's about a woman who gets abused. And what she is a chaste woman. She serves in the temple of Athena. Athena is the goddess of divine wisdom, of divine intellect, of society, the norms in society. That's Athena. And Athena has a servant called Medusa. She was a priestess, and she was a virgin. And she was raped by Athena's uncle, who's another god. He's the god of the sea. He's a kind of wild fellow. And he's raped in Athena's temple. Now, you would think Athena would be angry at her uncle, but oh no. She gets angry at Medusa and turns Medusa into a gorgon. Now, a gorgon is the monstrous being with snakes for hair. Okay, so Medusa is a symbol of a trauma. Okay, so in this story, we're picturing what happens to a virgin or a chaste woman when she's raped in a sacred temple and then blamed. And she's cast into the darkness. She lives in a cave, basically. And when anyone sees her, they turn into stone. Now, that's the myth of Medusa. She is so ugly that people turn to stone. Now, in the Greek myth, she's slain by a Greek hero. They're very masculine myths. But there are earlier myths where a Medusa-like creature who's in the underworld, she has to be listened to. And there are earlier myths that are Sumerian. There's actually a myth called Inanna, where the goddess of the heavens descends to see her twin sister in the underworld who's enraged. And part of the healing, it's a little like psychotherapy, is that the sister's pain has to be listened to. So no one wants to listen to Medusa, the rage of this very, very angry, hurt woman that's been consigned to the shadows. And so she's slain, she's beat up on further. And
Mm-hmm.
in our own world, we need to start listening to Medusa, the aspect in the woman that is really exiled, estranged, and consigned to the darkness and the silence because she bears this horrible atrocity that happened to her that she's often blamed for.
Exactly. I mean, if we relate that myth, it's a very, very good example for everyone to understand. Like, if we relate that Greek myth with whatever happens in our society, so we can know that, like, I mean, I've heard literally many stories where people are actually abused and they go through a lot of suffering. So what happens is that they, the one who are victims, are actually being blamed, right? They are being blamed by their parents, they are being blamed by their family, they're blamed by their society. So again, there comes a moral perspective in that, right? So I I,
Yeah,
I don't think. Mhm. Mhm.
yeah, and very often because of that blame and that silence, people get very, very sick, and they act out of that sickness. And in many cases, they can become self-abusive, they can become
Mhm.
self-destructive, addictive. In some cases, they become violent and they act out their aggression on other people. Sometimes, and I'll turn this into a male perspective, some men that have been raped rape other men, and they keep
Exactly.
reenacting their own rape by raping someone else. So a
Mhm.
sickness keeps reseeding itself, generation by generation.
Exactly. So maybe they need to, uh, obviously, they need to be heard, right? Their woundings need to be acknowledged first, and then obviously they can work on that. But obviously, if it goes unheard like that, then they can be the one who goes further into abusing someone else.
Yes, and it's very hard because you very often need to create a culture of healing where
Exactly.
someone can break through that shame and be heard by other people who understand it. And they have
Hmm.
to be safe enough to begin that work. It just can't happen overnight. You have to have safety, and you also have to have a community that understands your story.
Exactly.
That's
There
actually the
needs to be
first
a.
two steps of
Mhm.
recovery.
Yeah. So like rage into the shadows, if we make it in very simple words, so that would be like the when the victims are actually being blamed. So what happens is that they they internalize that's blame, and it turns and their anger goes deep into the shadows, like into the unconscious, or they, you can say that they suppress that, or even sometimes it's so, the trauma is so painful that all the aggression or anger towards the abuser is literally repressed, right? So that. Mhm.
Yeah, it's like I would say it becomes like a self-hatred that
Exactly.
gets directed to the oneself. And there's another idea I want to give this. It's a psychological idea, but it's very, very true. It's called splitting.
Mhm. Yep.
And if there's enough pain and trauma, the psyche splits, and it splits against itself. So, and
Hmm.
I'll give you, it mimics the abusing parent, because the abusing parent, for example, is both your protector and your abuser. So
Exactly.
that person has two roles. They protect you on one hand, and the next breath they can be abusing you. The psyche splits into two. So one is the part that is a persecutor. So it's
Hmm.
persecuting the self, and so the self begins to persecute itself.
Hmm. Yep, that makes sense. I mean, it's kind of an internal split of psyche. They can be either like a guardian and a nurturing parent, and again, it can be also self-criticizing or abusing parent.
Yeah, so it's the words would be protector, persecutor. So on one
Yep,
hand, my parent protects me, on the other hand, it persecutes me, but my own psyche can protect me, but also persecute me. And I try to protect myself against the persecution that I'm doing to myself. And that can
exactly.
be initiated by rape and abuse and trauma. And psychosis, it's kind of like an ongoing obsession or psychosis or deep depression psychotic. And that's why it's very, very hard to treat, and it's not simple.
Yep, that makes sense. So I'll just sum up this point in very simple words so that it's easy for people to understand that what we all discussed. So it would be like when someone is actually abused and they are not heard, and in return, as we discussed the Medusa myth, so the victims are the one who are actually blamed, either by the
Yes.
parents or by the society. So they get blamed that it was you who did that, or it might have been you who actually seduced the other person, or it might be you who actually went into all this. So that's what we see in our society from parents and relatives who actually blame the victims who are abused. So what
Yeah,
happens is
that's
that they
called the scapegoat. Yeah. Hmm.
scapegoat. Yeah, we see that scapegoating. So what happens is their rage, anger, aggression towards the incident goes deeper into the unconscious, into the shadows, and it gets more of a deep wounding, and it turns into self-blame. They start blaming their own self, hating their own self, and even their perception about the world is shattered. Their perception about uh, people is shattered. I would say that their innocence sort of it's it's shattered actually.
Actually, no, actually, that's perfect because what it does is it does shatter innocence. It shatters the Garden of Eden. If you know the old biblical story of the snake in the Garden of Eden, that's the trauma. It comes
Yep,
in, it shatters things, it shatters faith in people. I'm going to say this, it shatters faith in God. How could
exactly.
a God permit this to happen to an innocent child? Oh, and then people say, you're not innocent because it wouldn't have happened. God's just. How could you be going through this with a just God? So you must have done something.
Exactly. I mean that happens. We see that happening in our society. Even in every society, we see that the victims are actually, are mostly they are the ones blamed. So they are blamed for whatever happens. So so symptoms of trauma and abuse.
Yes. Okay. Basically, these are a couple of points here. One thing that happens is kind of an amnesia. And
Hmm.
if this happened at an early age, a lot of stuff goes into the unconscious. There's a denial, and there's a reason for that. It's not like just copping out or avoiding. For a
Hmm.
child to maintain their functioning, they have to protect themselves. The psyche automatically does this, it's not even conscious.
Hmm.
It forgets, it has amnesia, it blocks out. Uh, the stuff goes into delusional thinking, any kind of way to block out that experience, which was so painful, it shattered the psyche.
Hmm. So it's like the incident is so painful and powerful for a child or even for the adult, so that it's not under their control that it goes into the unconscious or it gets repressed. It's just the intensity of a trauma, so that they undergo this
It's
process.
the intensity of it, right? Right.
Hmm.
It's like even guys that were in combat, PTSD, they
Hmm.
witness things that are so awful. There's no way for them to maintain their equilibrium and their integrity in what they've seen and experienced. And this is very tragic stuff. And when I talk about this, there's a sense of tragedy. You've been poisoned or something's own principles.
Yep.
Um, Again, we're talking about moral wounding, which is
Hmm.
part of complex PTSD. If you feel like you're damaged goods or you're tainted in some fashion, you become self-destructive, you become self-punishing, and you may begin to violate your own principles.
Hmm.
Now, some of those may be sexual principles or stealing or other behaviors that don't fit into the good person images, the good girl, the good boy.
Hmm.
And in a way, you're acting out because there's something very disturbing in your basement, if I was going to put it that way, in your
Uh-huh.
unconscious.
Yep. Hmm.
Um, and so you begin to break your own principles. And very often, if you've been abused, you may become an abuser. That's also
Exactly. Yep. I think it, can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, so I think we can say it in a way that even I've witnessed that actually. So what happens is that maybe like the people who are actually abused, so they have too much hatred and self-hate and towards them, that their whole moral perception about themselves and everyone is so much shattered that they actually consider no more morality within them, and they don't even want to consider that. So it's just maybe due to the trauma, and they consider themselves really impure and bad, so they can easily violate their own principles.
Yes, I'd even use the word self of a society where everyone pretends they're very good and somehow
I think it's muted again. Yep.
Also, a sense that certain societies can be very hypocritical. Everyone's acting very moral, but they're still abusing people, either financially or
Mm-hmm.
emotionally or physically or sexually. And
Mm-hmm.
somehow you're the damaged goods and you begin to act out against that society. The only role that may be left is the rebel role.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That makes sense. So yeah, so the next is development of diffuse boundaries. I think that can be a very interesting point.
Yes, if you've been violated enough, you don't really know where your identity begins and ends, especially if people have used their power over you to dominate you. And again, I want to use the word abuse to mean often domination. Even if
Mm-hmm.
it's sexual abuse, it has to do with dominating and ruling over. So you lose
Exactly.
your sense of self and efficacy
Mm-hmm.
because you're
So.
certainly not in control of who comes into your bedroom at 3 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
or what's done to you in the schoolroom by the diffuse boundaries. Do we need to do that?
Yep.
Okay, if you get violated enough, and remember, something like a rape or abuse is also an act of dominion or domination.
Mm-hmm.
You lose your ability to be in control of your normal functions of your body,
Mm-hmm.
of even of your own mind. You lose control over yourself. So your identity gets fractured.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very, very hard to know where you begin or end, what's normal, to say no, to say yes,
Mm-hmm.
what's
Exactly. That
reasonable.
happens really in life.
Yes, to even acknowledge what may be a reasonable need. You have no sense anymore. That gets broken up.
So do you think that such people who are abused and they were dominated, as you use the word, so they have kind of development of diffuse boundaries. So in future, do you think that in the life, when in adulthood, do they really face problems because of that diffuse boundaries?
Yes, it's hard to know what's reasonable. What's
Mm-hmm.
reasonable respect from another person if you've been
Mm-hmm.
abused. But on the other hand, you might have an explosive type of person who, because they're so diffuse, they just violate other people's boundaries.
Exactly. Maybe they kind of have they are not even able to differentiate between self integrity, self dignity, and what what are others' boundaries and their own boundaries. Maybe.
Yeah, and think of it as that a healthy socialization process has been interrupted.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. So the next one is emotional and psychological exile. I believe that's about like being casted out or a sense of isolation when you think of yourself as very uh, you think again you think of someone being very impure or something like that.
Yeah, so there's a shame, and so either the society casts you out or you cast yourself out. And
Hmm.
by that I mean that you run and hide in the shadows, or you
Hmm.
exile yourself. Even internally, you could split from
Hmm.
yourself. Part of you that was abused may go into exile.
Hmm.
So it's not so readily accessible. It's almost can go into the unconscious in a sense. So retrieving that part of yourself that's been wounded, that's an act of great love and great patience.
Exactly.
We're going to go into the next piece here, which is escape by altered states. Uh,
Hmm.
if you've been violated, one of the easiest types of defenses. Uh, here we are. Yes, we are. Okay, I got it.
Hmm.
So people escape by altered states. Now, one of the most profound ones is that people dissociate.
Hmm.
That means that your emotions and your thinking separate from one another.
Hmm.
And you can have a sense of living outside of yourself or feeling very disconnected, of
Hmm.
not feeling, or of repressing thought. So
Hmm.
there's a breakage in self. And so to also alter states, people use addictions. Now, by addiction, I mean something that is mood altering.
Uh-huh.
So an addiction to sex or drugs or alcohol or power over other people, that's a form of addiction too. It means that you can alter your emotions to escape out of a terrible feeling. Of altered states is blocking your feelings or blocking your thoughts, because
Hmm.
the thoughts are so painful, or the feelings are so painful that you have to numb yourself.
Exactly. I mean, they're so uncomfortable that either people go into addictions and compulsive sexual acting out, right? So
Yes.
that happens when
And
they're
the
too
other
much in
aspect,
disturbed states.
yes, and the other aspect of this is that sometimes they're intrusive thoughts.
Hmm.
Now, intrusive thought, in the middle of just talking to your aunt, up comes a thought, your husband raped me,
Exactly.
or I'd like to kill you comes up.
Hmm.
But of course, you
Hmm.
don't, the underlying thing is you're the wife of the guy who raped me. So a
Exactly.
thought comes in, or it's like nightmares that reoccur. So you're getting
Hmm.
fragments of monsters appearing in your nightmares, horrible situations, and that's the trauma reappearing, and it intrudes on your life.
Exactly. And we see that very much happening.
So you have two sides. One is numbness, and the other is intrusion.
hmm. Yep, that makes sense. So I think that we are here done with the symptoms of trauma and abuse. So let's move towards healing from trauma.
Yes. Really essential to begin a healing process. The first thing is safety.
Hmm.
If you're being abused currently, how can you heal if you're under threat or under a current abuse? So like if you're in the middle of a war, how are you going to heal?
Exactly. Hmm.
So the first thing is having safety. And here in the United States, they've often had women's shelters where people could escape from an abusive mate.
Hmm.
And that's where you start the process. So safety is the first task. That could take months for a
Exactly.
person to feel safe enough to begin to work on something deeper.
Or
And as
even
a
have
matter of
a
fact,
safe or sound environment, even to share with someone the whole story. Actually, they
yes,
need very
and the
sound
reality,
environment.
yeah, and the reality is, therapeutically, you don't necessarily want a person to begin to share their story too deeply because it overwhelms them. The
Exactly.
effects, the affect of that story, the thoughts can be so overwhelming from a childhood, a whole childhood of
Hmm.
abuse or very traumatic things, that they need time to feel safe and to bond with other people. Then the
Exactly.
next stage would be the memories
Hmm.
and working through memories.
Hmm.
Okay, which is moving something that's semi-conscious or unconscious into the conscious mind, but you have a stable enough base to work with.
Exactly. First step would be a safe environment and very strong bond, and then it would be going through the memories, and then obviously slowly they can start sharing that.
Yeah, the memories, in a way, I'm going to phrase it in a different way. It's retelling your story maybe many, many times, maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe 20 times
Hmm.
to a group of people who will understand your story. It's
Exactly.
not just bystanders,
Yep.
because they're not an adequate witness to your story. Someone who's been traumatized or someone who's worked with trauma will
Hmm.
understand what you're trying to say. In some ways, the things you cannot say, they will help you to say.
Exactly. That's true.
And that moves on to the next point, which is moving from self-blame to understanding. And you
Hmm.
need to have people who love you enough to begin to switch your story. And that's how you move from victim. And it's important to say, I've been victimized. There's an injustice that's happened. But
Hmm.
you move from being stuck in a victim. If you're in the victim too long, it's important
To a
to leave them.
savior. Hmm.
But then you can move to being a survivor.
Yep.
And a survivor has a certain dignity. It means that I've gone through this and I'm beginning to grow from accepting what I've gone through. There is a beauty in who I am that was not marred. But
Hmm.
that's a journey that doesn't happen in 3 days or 30 days.
Obviously.
That can be
Yep.
a lifetime journey.
Exactly. I mean, here's what maybe people need to hear, that it's not their fault if it's taking too much time, because what we see is that people get too much irritated with their thoughts, with the blame. Obviously, there should be some people around who need to tell them that it's a very slow and a gradual process. It can take months, years, and literally many years. So it's not like which would happen in a month or a 2 month. So it can take years. So it's not their fault if they are like having too much of the thoughts or suffering. It's just a natural organic process which would move on with its own pace, right?
Yes, no, that's exactly right. The only caveat is that someone can get stuck in their process too,
Hmm.
where they don't progress because there isn't the right help or right understanding. That's when we
Exactly.
talk about being stuck in victimhood. People will often say you're stuck in victimhood, but you had to experience yourself as a victim of an injustice to begin to heal. But then if you get stuck in that, you just get stuck in not moving forward. And
Exactly, you know.
yes, you can get stuck in being a victim. It's important to acknowledge that you were a victim. If you were raped by your uncle, you were a victim. Okay,
Yep.
your elder uncle, or if you were a victim in war where you were multiply raped, even a child soldier who was first raped and then turned into a
Mhm.
child soldier, you're a victim.
So I have a question here. Like, I mean, there are many people out, even in my country, like who are from very underdeveloped areas. So mostly people usually face that these things there. So they don't have like sound and safe environment. They don't have understanding people. So would those people stay in victimhood all the life because they have no one to support them? Because as you mentioned that we need people actually to bring us out of the trauma, and we can obviously then move from victim to survivor.
Survivor.
Yeah,
Yeah, again, with your country, I wouldn't say necessarily that they stay in victimhood. They stay in illness.
exactly.
They're ill. And I think
Hmm.
the problem with victimhood as a psychological term is
Uh-huh.
that it's often used to blame someone who's incapable of making a change.
Exactly.
Basically, I'm a great therapist. If you're not moving forward, it's because you're stuck in victimhood. You don't want to take responsibility, and I may not know what to do to help you. So we have to be very careful about that word victimhood.
Hmm.
But when you see someone who's a survivor, it means they've started to move out of being disabled to starting to make some changes. And very often it takes, like, for example, in this country, we had the women's movement.
Hmm.
Because women were helping other women to get empowered, it
Hmm.
helped people to move into an activist role.
Uh-huh. Yep.
So people say you're just being a victim, but they might be afraid of that woman if she became an activist. They wouldn't like that.
Hmm.
So in a way,
So
they might even prefer the victim to the activist.
exactly. So how would you? I would even love if you could explain the word, or even you could tell us overview. What would word victimhood exactly means in terms of sexual abuse? How does people, or how can people stay for a long time in victimhood? Because they're often blamed by this word. So maybe it would help them understand the, what exactly does that mean here.
Yeah. Well, there's a phrase I looked at.
Yep.
We have a phrase in America about poor people, and we say
Uh-huh.
they should pick themselves up with their own bootstraps. But
Uh-huh.
if you don't own a pair of boots, how can you pick yourself up by your bootstraps? Bootstraps are what you do to pull your boots on.
Mm-hmm.
If
Yep.
someone does not have the means for recovery, you can't say they're trapped in victimhood. You can only say they don't have the means of recovery. Now,
Exactly.
someone may be afraid of recovering and going through it, and then you might begin to say, okay, they're choosing not to work on this because they're too afraid or it's too conflictual. There might be reasons. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
very careful about pinning the word victimhood on someone. It's a psychological phrase. And doctors and psychologists are notorious for putting labels on people. I'm very, very careful
Exactly.
with that.
Yep, I think we should be we need to be careful with this word. So do you think so it would be like during that process if they are not able to move, so in victimhood, if I use the word, so do they find problem or do they have some kind of difficulty actually accepting that they were abused?
It might be anywhere. I mean, you might be stuck in the self-blame or blaming someone else. I think usually with victimhood, there's the sense of blaming someone else.
Uh-huh.
And basically, okay, I was raped, I was abused. What you did to me defines my whole life. And when you
Okay.
move into
Mhm.
survivorhood, you say, I'm still wounded, but I'm not going to let you define my whole life. I'm more
Exactly.
than this person you raped. I'm
Hmm.
Jane, or
Hmm.
I am Fatima, and I have dignity, and I'm going to be something. And that takes a
Exactly.
great deal of soul and soul power, but you often need a community to help you get back in touch with that. It's not
Exactly.
so easy when
Hmm.
your whole identity has been smashed.
I believe that would be like carrying your spiritual carrying your wounds with spiritual dignity.
Yes, but you often need to be around someone who's already done that. To give an example,
Exactly.
if there is a wonderful woman who went through similar rapes or abuse and she becomes an activist, and you see being with her a woman who's regained her dignity, you say to yourself, my God, it's possible. It's
Mm-hmm.
not enough just to say, you know, I read in the Bible that you should get over it and forgive someone, or the psychologists say you need to move on who's made the journey. And that gives one the inspiration and confidence to make the journey oneself. I'm going to make a funny kind of comparison.
Mm-hmm.
That person who's made the journey is your spiritual teacher.
Mm-hmm.
A spiritual teacher is someone who has lived through the solution of something. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just someone who's read a bunch of books. They've
Exactly.
been violated, they've been wounded, and they've come back to life, and they are a spiritual testimony, not in what they say, but just in their life itself.
Exactly. Yep. That's
They're
true.
what we call an exemplar, someone who
Yep.
is an example of living out a truth.
Or I would say that the wounded healer archetype, or even the Greeks, they say that the physician needs to be a wounded one.
Yes, but in this case, the physician has found the healing, and it doesn't mean they don't have a wound, but they
Exactly.
have illuminated their wound. There's a beautiful old passage from the Hebrew Bible, and it says something like, the rejected stone became the cornerstone of
Foundation.
the temple.
Exactly. That's so beautiful.
And what that means is the stone that was impure, cast out, rejected, becomes holy. And the
Exactly.
person who regains their soul,
Mm-hmm.
picture a person who's lost their soul who regains it. That's a holiness that oftentimes people who never lost themselves will never know, because they
Mm-hmm.
had to go through a journey of darkness to regain themselves. Those are
That's
the
true.
people I am in awe of. I really am.
Mm-hmm. So the next one is, and that's very important.
A person who went through the darkness would be called an enlightened witness, because they really bring light from their own darkness. But
Mm-hmm.
also, there's the sense that, as say a child is abused, there's a loving aunt or a teacher, someone who knows what true love is, who says what happened to you is bad, it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The auntie, in a sense, is the enlightened person in this. Doesn't mean you have to be a psychologist or a Buddha sitting under a tree. An enlightened witness is someone with an enlightened heart.
Mm-hmm.
And because of their lovingness, they help you to tune into your own heart. And that person helps you to see that the beautiful part of you is still worthy of being cherished.
Exactly. That's what they need mostly at that time.
Yes, and it's really the lovingness of a person. It's not just the psychological understanding, it's a kind of lovingness.
Mm-hmm. That's
But it's
great.
also a wisdom. Your grandmother could be that light witness.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I believe because they are very free from the biasness of society, morals, and the pseudo morality things.
Well, they love you for yourself. I mean, that's the
Exactly.
aspect of this. And so even though you've been tarnished by something, they see how beautiful you are in the midst of your pain. This is what a
Mm-hmm.
therapist does, a good therapist. I don't mean just someone who's doing psychology. A good therapist will see the beauty of who you are in the midst of your pain and does.
Uh, it's mu- it's muted again. It's muted, I believe.
Yes, a good therapist is the one who sees your beauty in the midst of your pain and does not let go. Does not let
Yep.
go of that child who's hiding in the darkness, because the therapist or the grandmother, either one, sees how beautiful that child is and will not let go of it.
Exactly. I believe that that's what most people, or the therapist, I would say, they try to, abandon that child within them, which is in the darkness, and it's like stealing innocence from them.
Well, you have to feel your own child within to
Mm-hmm.
be able to connect to that child, I believe.
Exactly. Yeah,
I mean,
that's
some
true.
people can do it somewhat intellectually, but I think on a deeper level, if your child is available, your inner child,
Hmm.
wisdom, not just the lovingness of your child, but also a wisdom to know what you're doing with it.
Exactly, that's true. We all need to have that. So that's the last part, needs of healing trauma.
Yes, and again, this is a little like a recap. We
Exactly.
first have to have safety.
It's muted again.
Yes.
Yep, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, we first have, this is like a recap again. We
Mm-hmm.
first have to have safety to work with a
Mm-hmm.
person. And
Yep.
after there's a sense of safety, the person is able to go through a mourning. And in mourning, I mean that you have to mourn the loss of your innocent self.
Exactly.
And there's no time limit on that because of the brokenness and the preciousness of what was lost, and the
Mm-hmm.
years that may have been lost in sickness to this, and the
Mm-hmm.
economic opportunities because your sense of self was fragmented, and the ability to marry or to be in relationship. There's so many losses that take
Mm-hmm.
mourning.
Mm-hmm.
And this brings us to the next one. Very often people have a fantasy. I can do this healing by a quick catharsis. That means a burst of energy. And
Mm-hmm.
either I can have an instant revenge, I'll take it out on someone and I'll be better, or I can
Mm-hmm.
instantly forgive people and I'll be all of a sudden better. And
Mm-hmm.
forgiveness is a journey.
Mm-hmm.
Revenge, I wouldn't suggest, but you may need justice. Justice is very important. If you've been abused,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes calling that person who abused you into the range of justice, which may mean legal action,
Mm-hmm.
is the start of a process that may lead to forgiveness. But without
Exactly.
justice, you may find no peace. You've heard the protesters recently crying,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
who's been abused, to
Mm-hmm.
expect them to forgive an uncle that's abused them for 20 or 30 years to come to lunch with that person. That's unfair.
Yep. That's true. So the next one is reintegration into the life. I believe that's the last but not the least and the most important, I would say.
Yeah, that's the end of the journey, and that's never ending because, basically, if you've been abused and lived in the shadows, been very ill, just to come back into life, to be with other people may be a major step. To have a friend and trust a friend may be a major step. To take a job may be a relationship, can be a major step. These are all major points of a journey. They don't happen overnight, but they
Mm-hmm.
best happen with a group of supportive people.
Exactly. I believe the group of supportive people, uh, it's like a collective healing umbrella. You just have all the people, and it's like shading you into a collective healing environment.
Yes, the wound happened. The first thing we said today was that the wound happened in a social context.
Mm-hmm.
So the wound, even for a child, that extended beyond the household. It was what other people thought, what a whole society thought. They bore the shadow of a society. So it takes the love of another group of people to help you to reintegrate first into that group and maybe beyond that group. But you
Mm-hmm.
have to build your identity to leave that group and move beyond.
Mm-hmm. So great. So I have like last two questions here. So
Sure.
one is like, if after moving on, let's say one has accepted the trauma, right, and they have moved on in life, but is it still possible that they keep facing such intrusive thoughts and all the memories? So if they face, would that be, I mean, most of people get very uneasy with that. Like, if we have moved on, then why still we are getting these memories? So how should we address them, right? Like, if even like it's like discouraging moment for them, like they say we have moved on, we have accepted that we were abused, and we have moved on in life, in relationship, and we are working on. So why still we continuously facing those memories?
Because there's a wound, there's an inner wound. In the wound, this is the truth of the wound. In some ways, the wound acts like God.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what you throw at it, no matter what you rationalize about it, whatever your timetable is, it heals in its own timetable. Now, if you're not taking care of the wound, that's on you. But it
Mm-hmm.
takes time to heal something. It's an organic process. Picture someone who's abducted by a cult or taken in by ISIS. They were
Mm-hmm.
abused multiple times, passed around in slavery, witnessed abuses and violence of all sorts. Why would they get over that in a year period or 2 years that would haunt them for a long, long, long time. So in a way,
And that mhm,
you learn to be with your ghosts.
exactly,
Maybe healing in a
and
way.
that wouldn't be the victimhood, right? Because they have moved on, but still they're facing those memories and thoughts. So that isn't victimhood.
No, I don't think it's a victimhood, but you still have the wound. Being wounded doesn't mean being victim.
Hmm.
It means that you're wounded. And these are lifelong wounds. Someone who's been through a concentration camp. I'll give you an example. Currently,
Hmm.
the Uyghurs in China.
Hmm.
Someone who's been raped and physically beaten and been in these camps for numbers of years and then sent to a factory. Why would they get over that in 6 months or 3 years? Those are lifelong traumas.
I
And
believe that's the essence of being human, the fragility which God gives us in our body, in our heart. So we can say that's the human fragility. Even
okay,
after the trauma, after even moving on in your life, discovering new phases of life, still if you face those memories, that's the fragility of being human.
oh, absolutely. I mean, in Christianity, the symbol is the crucifixion. If you've
Hmm.
been crucified by life, and picture being in a Chinese concentration camp for 3 or 4 years,
Hmm.
beaten, raped, abused, starved, or in North Korea, or in Syria for that matter, bombed, you're crucified watching your children be murdered in front of you. Why would you get over that? You bear that wound. Some people are disfigured for the rest of their lives. Other people will show you their wounds, but they still bring something good into life.
Hmm.
Spirituality doesn't mean not being wounded. It means bringing something good into life with your wounds and through your wounds. In a way, the
Exactly.
wound becomes a doorway for God to move through. It doesn't mean that the wound totally heals, but
Hmm.
out of that wound can come mercy, can come understanding for other people with wounds.
That makes sense. So, one of the last question, and I think many of the people would have a very similar question. Like, let's say if someone who's abused doesn't have anyone to share with, anyone who will be understanding, because they obviously know their situation, right? They know the people around them. So if they
Right.
don't find that they're good people, they're understanding people around them, so how come they can get out of all that suffering? And I mean, how can they be easy with all those intrusive thoughts, suffering, depression, anxiety? Because there's no one around them. I mean, even if they're surrounded by people, but they don't have any understanding people who would uh, get to know their wounds or really understand them and maybe validate their trauma. So, what should they do in that case?
We live in the age of the internet.
Uh-huh.
Through it, a lot of information about abuse and trauma, about the effects of it.
Yeah.
Okay, we're very fortunate. Take
Oh, it's again muted. I don't know what's happening. It's very weird.
Okay, I'm going to try one more time.
Yep.
Okay, we're very fortunate because we live in the age of the internet where people
Uh-huh.
can get information online in their own language. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're in rural Pakistan and you have the internet, you can read up about trauma and abuse. But even more, there's survivors groups online.
Mm-hmm.
You can look for other survivors, and that's within your own country and even nationally that you can talk with. That's the great gift now that would not have been happening, say, 30 years ago or 20 years ago.
Exactly.
You can find a community outside of your neighborhood, outside
Mm-hmm.
of your province.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
The
the most
people who
important thing.
actually suffered from that trauma of sexual abuse or any trauma, and it can be a very shared and healing community. They can help you.
Yes, if on this age, in a way, the community online could become an enlightened witness.
Mm-hmm. True.
So
That's
they're
true. Yep.
witnessing to you the decency of your being, what you went through, encouraging you on an everyday level. You find sometimes a friend that's almost like a pen pal would have been 30 or 40 or
Mm-hmm.
50 years ago, but you're
Mm-hmm.
able to correspond in real time with that person.
That's
And
true.
and that becomes your link. That's the enlightened witness, your link to a reality outside of your family, outside of your village.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So I believe we are here done with today's session, and I hope that people would really learn from this. And it would be really a helping and learning experience for them, and it was really an enlightening experience for me. Thank you so much, Zamin, for joining me on the podcast today again and enlightening many people actually on this crucial.
Thank you, Abdul. Really appreciated being with you.
Take care, Zamin. Have a good day.